Welcome to Phoenix Podcast, hosted by Amin Moinian. Where we deep dive into politics and economics and explore the philosophies and histories behind today's challenges. Today we're talking minimum wage laws. It's one of those things where like the intention, helping
Yeah.
people earn a decent living, sounds really great at first glance. But what happens when we kind of put on our economist hats and look at the real impact?
Yeah, that's where things get interesting, right? It's like that old saying, the road to hell is paved with good intentions. Minimum wage is a prime example of how, like, a seemingly simple solution can have a ripple effect through the entire economy.
Yeah, so let's break this down for our listeners. One of the big arguments for minimum wage is that it stimulates the economy. More money in workers' pockets means more spending, which helps businesses, right? But I get the feeling that's not the whole story.
You're right. It's tempting to think that just pumping more money into the system will automatically make it grow. It's like, no, imagine if you were baking a cake. Adding more sugar won't magically make a bigger cake. You need more flour, eggs, the whole shebang. The economy's kind of like that. Demand, which is, people wanting to buy things, is only one ingredient. You also need supply. Business is producing those things to keep the whole system going.
So if minimum wage hikes make it more expensive for businesses to operate, does that mean that could actually shrink the economy? Less hiring, maybe even businesses closing down?
Yeah, it's a definite possibility. Think about it from a business owner's perspective. If suddenly you have to pay your employees significantly more, but you can't raise prices to match because people just won't buy your product or service at the higher cost. What do? You might have to cut back on hiring, reduce hours, or even close up shop. That's not good for anyone, especially not the workers who are supposed to be helped by the minimum wage increase.
Right? It's like a domino effect. What seemed like a straightforward solution ends up hurting the very people it was meant to protect. It reminds me of something we talk about a lot on Phoenix Podcast, this idea of unintended consequences.
Exactly. And this is where classic liberal philosophy comes in. It stresses the importance of understanding how seemingly small government interventions can have far-reaching effects. The idea is that free markets, where prices are set by supply and demand rather than by some, decree, are generally more efficient and better at creating prosperity for everyone.
So if a business is doing well, they're more likely to pay their employees better anyway. To attract and keep good workers, it becomes a natural organic process rather than something forced.
Precisely. It's about creating an environment where businesses can thrive, which in turn benefits workers. It's a more sustainable and holistic approach than simply mandating a specific wage.
All right, so we've established that simply raising the minimum wage might not be the magic bullet solution it's sometimes made out to be. But are there any real-world examples of where these kinds of policies have backfired, places where good intentions led to some not-so-great outcomes?
Oh, absolutely. There are plenty of examples from around the world where minimum wage hikes have had unintended consequences. Yeah, one example that comes to mind is France, specifically the youth unemployment crisis that plagued them for years. They had a really high minimum wage. And while it did offer some protection for the people who actually had jobs, it made it so hard for like young people and those entering the workforce to find any employment.
So businesses, especially smaller ones, just couldn't afford to hire inexperienced workers at that rate. So young people were stuck needing a job to gain experience, but couldn't get a job without experience.
Exactly. It's a classic example of how a well-intentioned policy can actually create a barrier to entry for, the most vulnerable people in the job market.
So if a high minimum wage can have these kinds of unintended consequences, what are some of the alternatives? I mean, we all want to make sure people can earn a living wage and have opportunities to improve their lives. So what are some other ways to achieve that without potentially hurting the very people we're trying to help?
Yeah, that's the million-dollar question. And, it's not about being against workers or anything like that. It's about finding solutions that actually work in the long run. One idea that's gaining traction is something called the Earned Income Tax Credit, or EITC for short.
EITC. I've heard of that, but to be honest, I don't totally get it.
Yeah,
Can you break it down for me? How does it work?
sure. It's a pretty elegant solution, actually. Basically, instead of, forcing businesses to pay a higher wage, the government gives a tax break to low-income workers. So it's targeted help that goes directly to the people who need it most, without adding this, like, blanket cost burden to every business.
Okay, so it helps those struggling to make ends meet, but doesn't necessarily hurt businesses in the process. Are there other approaches out there to try to tackle this from different angles?
Absolutely. Another idea that's been getting a lot of buzz, although it's more controversial, is the concept of a universal basic income, or UBI.
Ah, UBI. The idea of just giving everyone a set amount of money, no strings attached, sounds pretty radical. What are the arguments for and against something like that?
Well, the people who support it argue that in a world with, increasing automation and traditional jobs being replaced, UBI could provide a safety net for everyone, ensuring a basic standard of living regardless of employment status. The idea is it could free people up to pursue education, entrepreneurship, or creative endeavors without having to worry about money all the time.
That's interesting. It really challenges how we traditionally think about work and income. But I imagine there are some concerns about a system like that, too.
Of course there are. Critics worry about the cost of implementing such a big program and whether it would discourage people from working. Some people also argue that it's a massive overreach of the government.
So it seems like there's no easy answer here. There are valid points on both sides. Which reminds me of something we emphasize a lot on Phoenix Podcast, the importance of critical thinking.
Absolutely. It's about really engaging with complex issues, considering all these different perspectives, and understanding that there are often trade-offs involved. There's rarely a perfect solution. But through open and honest debate, we can hopefully move closer to policies that benefit everyone.
That's a great point. But let's get back to the specifics of minimum wage for a moment. I think it would help our listeners to hear some specific examples of how different countries have approached this and what the results have been. Could you walk us through a few case studies?
Of course. Let's take a look at a few different approaches from around the world. Okay, so let's start with a country we talked about earlier, New Zealand. Unlike France, with its fixed minimum wage, they have a tiered system. So they recognize that a 16-year-old starting their first job isn't going to be as productive as someone with years of experience. So they actually have a lower minimum wage for younger workers. And it gradually increases as they gain experience and, build up their skills.
Okay, I see. It gives younger people a chance to get started and earn some money while still having some level of protection. Did that approach seem to work out for them?
Well, it seems like it helped. Youth unemployment in New Zealand is much lower than in a lot of other developed countries, countries with higher minimum wages. So it shows that sometimes a more nuanced approach, one that's tailored to, the realities of the job market, can be much more effective.
That's a great example. What about some other approaches? Are there countries that have taken a completely different path on minimum wage?
Oh, yeah, for sure. South Africa, for example, uses a system called sectoral bargaining. So instead of having one minimum wage for the entire country, different industries actually negotiate their own minimum wage agreements with, labor unions and stuff.
Interesting. So like the minimum wage for a restaurant worker could be different from what a construction worker makes, based on the specific needs of those industries.
Right, exactly. It allows for more flexibility and customization, recognizing that a one-size-fits-all approach isn't always going to work.
Yeah.
But of course, it also has its own challenges. It can be more complicated to manage, and there's always the risk of certain industries, gaining an unfair advantage over others.
Yeah, it sounds like finding that right balance is key. Too much rigidity and you end up with unintended consequences. But too much flexibility in things can become uneven.
Exactly. It's all about, weighing those pros and cons and finding solutions that fit the situation.
I think this deep dive has been really eye-opening. The minimum wage debate is so much more complex than just being for or against it. There's so many things to consider, and the impact really depends on the specific approach you take.
Yeah, that's one of the things I find so interesting about economics. It's not about finding those simple answers. It's more about understanding how these complex systems actually work and then using that knowledge to make informed decisions.
That's a great way to put it. So as we wrap up this deep dive into minimum wage laws and all these different alternatives, what is the main thing you want listeners to remember?
I think the most important thing is to remember that good intentions don't always lead to good outcomes. When it comes to economic policy, it's so important to think critically, to consider those unintended consequences we talked about, and to be open to all sorts of different viewpoints.
Well said. And that's what we're all about here on Phoenix Podcast, encouraging thoughtful discussions and helping our listeners understand the world a little bit better.
Exactly. At the end of the day, we're all in this together, and finding solutions that work for everyone is really the ultimate goal.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive, everyone. Until next time, keep questioning, keep exploring, and keep learning.